There we go. So again, welcome everybody to the week three of the Crusades, specifically doing the first Crusade, um, and doing part two of the first of the first Crusade. So um, so with that, let us pray. Loving God, we thank you for your presence, for your teaching spirit. Be with us, we pray today. Surround us with your love and grace so that we may learn something new. And so we ask you to be present with us. Give us a sense of learning and give us a sense of questioning so that we may ask all kinds of questions that may come up. And keep us always in your grace. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. I'm just closing the door to make sure that the cat doesn't just sort of wander in and start, because whenever she is hears me talking, she assumes I'm talking to her, and then she responds back. So anyway, so for those of you who've been with us, of course, some of the overview here that we're doing is going to be familiar. Um, the I know about to sneeze. Pardon me. Um, uh, and so this is where we've been. We did, of course, the introduction, the political background to the Crusades, of how everything led up to this, the actual call to crusade from Pope Urban II, and then part of that I'll do in the recap of the madness that was the People's Crusade that preceded the actual military campaign. Um, and where we are today, of course, is dealing with the latter half of the First Crusade. And the reason that we're doing the First Crusade in two sessions and basically compacting the rest of them together is that none of the rest of the Crusades would have actually happened had this venture been a failure from the start. And so we get to the fact that the First Crusade realistically was probably genuinely the only truly successful the from start to finish uh, crusade in terms of um, unexpectedly meeting goals that weren't actually intended in the first place. Be the best way to put it. So next week we actually take the second and third crusades and actually compact them together, because you'll notice here that realistically they were only about roughly 40 years apart, whereas the first crusade was the was the 50 to 100 years uh, before that. And then we have the fourth Crusade and beyond, because many things started to pick up the name Crusade after that, and that's what we're going to be talking about. And then the aftermath and the legacy of the Crusader period. So, realistically, in terms of that, we'll get into that. For those of you who haven't been here, here's the operating definition of what the Crusades were. And so here's the definition that we've been working with, is that it was this series of campaigns, military campaigns in the Eastern Mediterranean, involving specifically Western European forces. Because Eastern European forces were constantly involved in this, particularly because the strength and presence of the Byzantine Empire is Eastern Europe. Um, but it was sanctioned officially by the Latin Church, specifically the church based out of Rome. And this ran from the late 11th century through until the almost the end of the 13th century. The dates we're working with here really are only until the end of the 13th century, 1291 being sort of the end of that. But the so-called Crusader era extended all the way up until about the 1492, which is a date that probably from history you you may are familiar with that calendar date because of another event, but that's related to what we will come to in the last session. And so we have that in play. Now, that's just in terms of background. First, as far as the First Crusade in Part One, in November 1095, in response to the Byzantine Emperor asking for mercenaries for help against specifically the Seljuk Turks in what we call Asia Minor, which is now modern day Turkey. Uh, and the Byzantine Emperor was simply looking for help against them. Made the appeal to the Pope because the Pope was the only one who had the communication network to make that happen. And the only way that the Pope could actually figure out a way of motivating Western European forces was to give them a goal of getting to Jerusalem. And if to make a long story short, and I've mentioned this already, is that if basically the idea was if anybody got to Jerusalem, they got an indulgence, which was sort of the equivalent of a get out of hell free card. And it evolved into a campaign of retaking the Holy Land. So the whole idea was when the Pope declared this or proclaimed this in November 1095, the point was that there would have to be a preparation period between November and August of 1096, that they agreed to depart Europe or to depart their various locations and make their way across Europe to get to Constantinople. The idea was they would leave on August 15th, and the idea probably by November they would get to Constantinople. The trouble is that many people didn't get that memo, and there were mobs of people that just simply started going, and this primarily became these traveling mobs sort of merged together and became this monstrosity called the People's Crusade. So the People's Crusade itself began to form in early 1096, and they just started migrating across Europe. And the trouble is that nobody knew where Jerusalem was. They just knew east. So in many cases, they just simply thought the next town or the next city over was Jerusalem, and they'd go and sack that town on their way, and they just pillaged as they went. It was this horrible this if it weren't so tragic, it would be hilarious. But that you had this ignorant mass of humanity moving, roughly 30,000 people moving across. And unfortunately, along the way, they also began to attack anybody who was different, and specifically the Rhineland massacres. And the Rhineland is nowhere even remotely close to the Middle East, even slightly, but they took it on as an excuse to go to persecute the Jewish communities, and specifically against, like, the Pope has said, like, look, Jewish communities are protected, and it just, to the mob, they didn't care, and in a way they went. And eventually the People's Crusade did make it to Constantinople well ahead of the formal military campaign. They were initially told to stay there and wait for the military campaign to show up, but because this mass of people who were very poor coming into the Byzantine Empire that looked to them very, very rich, they started pillaging the countryside around Constantinople. And to deal with this, within 5 days of them arriving, they guaranteed, like the Byzantine Emperor got them on ships and got them across the Bosphorus and just sent them into Asia Minor, because keeping them around Constantinople was just a bad idea. And not surprisingly, less than 100 kilometers into Asia Minor. They met the Seljuk Turks for the first time, and they were basically all but wiped out. I mean, there were some remnants of the 30,000 people that started out. There might have been a thousand left, and scattered into the countryside in October 1096. And so, keep in mind that in the Middle Ages, this was the accurate map of the world. So this is the map that they had to go by. And in other words, the map was completely useless. They had, sort of no idea where Jerusalem truly was, only that it was vaguely eastward. And so with that, so anyway, the military forces, on the other hand, who were much better prepared after the People's Crusade sort of marauded its way across Europe, the actual so-called First Crusade, which were organized military forces, agreed and left on the agreed departure date of mid-August, and started to make their way across from their various starting points across Europe. And that was, and they came from northern and southern France. They came from the Holy Roman Empire, as well as Norman-controlled Italy. So northern France which was also Norman controlled. Now you had the Norman, and basically it's the southern Sicily, the island of Sicily itself, and the bottom part of the boot. That's where they came from. And again, unlike the mob that was the People's Crusade, these were battle hardened because they had been busy fighting each other. They were well trained, they were well disciplined, and they were well supplied, and they started making their way across. And so a month after the People's Crusade was completely wiped out, they arrived in Constantinople in November and December, and organized and in agreements with camped out under under quite strict discipline under the Constantinople, and prepared over the winter to before crossing over into Asia Minor. And also during this time, the Byzantine emperor, he basically said, if you want to go across Asia Minor, it was basically, you have to be loyal to me. Any territory that you take is returned to the Byzantine emperor. You are not to take it for yourself. That's important because we're going to come back to that. And in exchange, we will give you supplies and transport and everything that you will need. Because at this point in time, also historically, at this point in time, the military power of the Byzantine Empire, they were well off, they were rich, but their military forces had been pretty badly depleted in previous iterations of conflict with the Seljuk Turks. So, the idea is that from the Byzantine emperor's point of view in Constantinople is that they just wanted to recover territory in Asia Minor that they had lost. And that's basically, so any territory you recover is now returned to the Byzantine Empire. Primarily, they were looking at just Asia Minor, or Anatolia, or however you want to pronounce it. Basically the body of land between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea that is called Asia Minor. And so this First Crusade, it was sometimes called the Prince's Crusade, in April of 1097. So, almost 18 months after the Pope first effectively declared crusade. They crossed in April. They arrived at Nicaea on May 6th. And began to lay siege to the city, and this we covered last week. And so the siege itself lasted just over a month. Curiously enough, it was actually the Byzantines who actually were able to get uh, the envoys into the city to arrange for their surrender. But one of the things that was interesting is that Nicaea itself is on the edge of a lake, and so the Turks were able to actually supply the city through on by way of the lake until the Byzantines provided the Crusaders with boats that they actually pushed across land on logs. Uh, and then so that they actually put some naval forces into the lake and then cut them off that way. And that took some time, and that's ultimately what precipitated the surrender. Um, and so between when the ships arrived and the actual surrender was 2 days. So it was important. And of course, the Byzantines negotiated the surrender, and in that surrender, the Crusaders were denied entry of Nicaea. Only the Byzantines could go in, or if the Crusaders did go in, they only could go in groups of 10. And so they were denied their plunder, because quite often that's how you paid an army. It's like whatever you happen to catch or steal or pick up after you've done your whatever your campaign, that was your pay. And then from Nicaea, then they moved on to Dorylaeum, and this is where they actually encountered the Turks in force. And because the Turks themselves had this previous experience of the mob from the People's Crusade, just rabble that had no no military background at all, the Turks themselves expected this new group to be just like the previous group, which was a fatal mistake. And so the idea, they started hitting their logistics, doing hit and run attacks. But you see, the Crusaders themselves were ready for this because, again, battle hardened. They understood how this worked. Supply lines were everything. And so what they did is they basically they split the force into two parts, laying basically one being bait and the other one being the force the force to actually deal with to counterattack. It was a decisive defeat of the Seljuk Turks and their leader Kiljuk Arslan. And that actually opened the door to all of Asia Minor. And in fact, they would meet very, very little resistance for most of their journey through the rest of Asia Minor. But at the same time, crossing, an army that moves by foot, even horseback, does not travel that fast. And it would take 3 months for them to go all the way across the Asia Minor, where they would eventually come to and then lay siege to Antioch, pretty much on the other side of Asia Minor. But as they were, the thing is, and as they were moving forward, the Turks weren't in any position to be able to resist the Crusaders who were marching through. And there were, aside from maybe the odd skirmish, there wasn't really any sort of significant fight on the way through. However, let's just go back to the Battle of Dorylaeum. So this is new information for tonight. So one of the figures in this was a Roman Catholic bishop, who Urban II had actually commissioned as a legate, as a diplomat in the middle of this, in terms of moving east, because at this point in time, any of the Christians that they would have encountered, even in these areas that the Turks had, would have been either under the overall, certainly in Asia Minor, they would be attached to Constantinople, at least liturgically. So they needed a diplomat as well. And he also began to be recognized as the spiritual leader of the campaign. Well, the different groups, because they came from different parts of Europe, quibbled over who was actually in charge. Largely, the Bishop Adhemar was seen as the spiritual leader of the group. and he had been to Jerusalem. He actually knew how to get there. And so that was so that was part of it. And he also was really working very, very, very hard to keep the peace between the Byzantines, who had their own goals, and the Europeans, who were just this almost powder keg, um, the of conflict, that he had to try and keep them from fighting with each other, but also never mind the Byzantines. Um, and the one of the things that I haven't really touched on is that because of the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, uh, the power vacuum created circumstances where you actually had bishops who ended up being military commanders, because there was no political force left in whatever of the diocese that they were in charge of, and so that they were also responsible for defending it. So Adhemar himself was actually, he was also a capable commander himself, um, and so, like, he was actually, um, uh, whether he was actually on a horse himself leading them into battle, he was certainly, the forces in his command uh, helped turn the tide at Dorylaeum. Um, but there were a lot of casualties. So in the Battle of Dorylaeum, the actual casualties that we're looking at, probably the Crusaders lost about 8 to 10% of their strength. Um, so, the Crusader army as a whole probably was in the neighborhood of somewhere around 40-ish thousand. And now, by the way, casualty doesn't mean dead, but casualty means injured, dead, captured. So, for example, I happened to do a funeral of a gentleman who was considered to be a casualty at Dieppe, but he was taken prisoner by the Nazis, and was eventually released in a prisoner exchange at a later point. But because he was captured, he's removed from the fighting force. Therefore, he's considered to be a casualty. Um, the Seljuks, on the other hand, even they had lost 3,000, but that was much closer to half of their battle strength at this point in time. So, this just reiterates what I've already said. So they're just not capable of fighting in the battle itself. Now, recovery time, they're able to recover forces and what have you, but also casualties can also be by accident, fatigue, or disease. And actually, one of the greater dangers was not military forces, but among other things, and we'll get into this a little later, was actually the climate, because getting casualties climate is part of that. So, and unfortunately, one of the things that did cause casualties was this. So eventually they start making their way across, and I'm about to show you a map of how long they had to go. Is that the forces of the Seljuk Sultanate, specifically in the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, is basically the Seljuk Turks, the territory that they controlled in Asia Minor. They weren't able to, because of that defeat, they had no forces left to be able to realistically stop or even slow down the European forces that were now marching their way. Uh, they're marching their way through. So instead of actually trying to fight them, they just basically burned the supplies ahead of them as they retreated. And of course, as the Crusaders move forward, behind them come in the Byzantines, who then begin reoccupying all of those different forces and starting to resupply them. So at this point in time, the Byzantines are actually getting exactly what they want. They're reclaiming the territory that they had lost after the Battle of Manzikert. And so the territory is basically this wide open frontier. the Crusaders are moving through, the Byzantines are behind. Now, granted, some of the forces are actually with the Crusaders just to kind of keep an eye on them, but for the most part, what they're doing is reoccupying the fortresses that they had once lost. And so, of course, the army, as they're moving forward, even though their next actual battle wouldn't be for 3 months, they didn't know that. And so it was a very cautious move forward. But of course, the longer you travel, an army has to move on its stomach, and this would eventually take its wear and tear on it. And so the now that said, of course, letters came back, letters started going back into Europe, messages in terms of the success at Dorylaeum. And so that did mean that there was actually a fresh group of people that started to say, hey, yes, this seems to be good. And then this started developing a network of transportation of bringing new volunteers who wanted to join in the effort. So it wasn't a case of they just had 40,000 and that's all they were getting. They were now, because of this good news, more people would start coming back. So here's a little bit of things that we have. There's Nicaea, there's Dorylaeum. By the way, this I believe this map is in French. But you see, so Nicaea, Dorylaeum is here, and the next you'll notice that, see these cross sword icons here and here, as well as here, and of course what you would see down here. But the next one along this path wouldn't be down till Antioch. So here we have this long path all the way through it. It took them 3 months to get from here to here. And of course, let's just talk a little bit about traveling. Now, this is something I can't say. I have never been anywhere. I mean, I suppose I've actually been across the lake from Turkey. There was one point when I was quite young, I was actually in Bulgaria, and didn't necessarily know it, but I suppose that's as close to the area as close to where as I could get. But have any of you been to Turkey or the Eastern Mediterranean? So, well, let's talk about climate. So the average daytime high, so average high, and this is prior to the current climate crisis. Average daytime high in Asia Minor in July and August is 30 degrees Celsius and very little rain. So very hot, very dry, and also very sunny. 80% chance of sunshine during these months. So like very very warm. Now, which if you're going there on holiday, great. Hey, that's nice and warm, nice and relaxing. But when you're a bunch of soldiers who originally come from Normandy, or like the Norman areas of France or Belgium, like sort of northern Europe, and let's compare that to Belgium at the same time of year. Average daytime high 15 degrees. Okay. Average rainfall quite a bit more than 10 times as much rain. And so the army itself was well equipped, but they were equipped for colder, wetter climates. So their dress themselves, and for various reasons, they were very much married to the way in which they dressed. Like, there were certain things of their armor that they put on, and so the armor that they would wear was often very very heavy, and in these kind of climates would be very very warm. And so that warm weather, that hot weather, took its toll on the troops. But The exact numbers we don't have, but there were certainly weather-related casualties in both soldiers and horses as they moved across Asia Minor. And so, but of course, they were as disciplined as they were. They had to find provisions and supplies as they moved. And of course, as I mentioned before, the Seljuk Turks basically doing a scorched earth as they retreated. There weren't as many supplies, and so there were Christian communities all throughout that region. They did support the armies because they saw them as liberating them from Seljuk rule. But unfortunately, the Crusaders took on this pattern that they, instead of trading for things, they more often ended up looting and pillaging villages or towns as they went and gaining supplies that way. So, so they more often looted as opposed to traded for. But all continue. The thing is, as the group is traveling forward, they were still coming off of a successful battle, and it just seemed that the Turks were retreating in front of them, and there was, but it was a group where there were several groups who all traveling together, but each of them had different loyalties, and there was because none of them were strong enough to lay claim to be the overall leader. To a certain degree, Bishop Adhemar was given kind of that deference in terms of that overall leadership to kind of hold things together, at least from a spiritual point of view. But and he was the closest thing to kind of tying them together. But each of the different groups had their own leaders, had their own ambitions, and we'll get to how that complicates things later. And they also had to rely on guides. Sort of generally you march in the direction that the sun goes up, but how do you navigate through the different valleys and things like that? And they relied upon the Byzantines to guide them through. But of course, there were several who didn't trust the Byzantines, especially with what happened at Nicaea, because how do we know that they're not going ahead and negotiating things where we don't get any, they get it all and we don't get anything. And among that, Tancred. Was one of the ones who himself was one of the ones who did this. And so there was actually, I'm just going to pop back to the map here. So the forces ended up splitting here. That the Byzantine guide said, let's go this way. And then another group particularly decided, no, in fact, we want to go this way, because that way, like south, Jerusalem's sort of they had a sense of Jerusalem's kind of that way. And then they also learned that, of course, Tarsus, where Paul of Tarsus was, well, that must be getting close to Jerusalem. So many stayed in this group, but another group started moving and split their forces that way. So, and so at this gate, the forces split, and the thing is, they weren't clear on what their goals were, maybe to seek allies, and they were now in Armenian territory, which was a Christian group, objectively, they were Armenian Christian. The Armenian Christians, they were in that territory. So objectively, friendly territory in terms of at least on paper, in terms of Eastern and Western there. But Tancred and Baldwin themselves, they went to towards Tarsus, which of course to them, well, Tarsus will get us there quicker. And then the rest of the group, followed, took a different path to Antioch. And the point was, if they went north through Antioch, it would be friendlier territory, easier to get supplies. That was the principle behind it. Whereas the Tancred and Baldwin would come down that way. But eventually, they found their way. The main army arrived at Antioch, and immediately they started to set up for siege, because at this point, the Seljuk Turks at this point in time had themselves set had started to lay defenses there. It was in Antioch. It's a fortified city in the Eastern Mediterranean. It is in modern day Turkey, but you would think that it's very close to the northern border of the border between Turkey and Syria. If you were to look at a map today. And so the idea was, it's well fortified, it's built into a mountain, it's got port access. There were all kinds of things, like it was a very well defended city. And of course, because of where it was located, a port city, it's located upon paths that would take you into the interior much easier. They needed to take Antioch in order to be able to, it could also be a supply point for them to move further to Jerusalem. Because if they didn't take it, the Seljuk Turks would use it as a base to be able to raid their lines, because, of course, Jerusalem was beyond it. So now, keep in mind, when I say the Seljuk Turks, the Seljuks actually had several different territories sort of under different political leadership. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was basically Asia Minor, but this is the main dynasty, the main Seljuk Turks at this point in time were the ones that controlled it. So they were actually separate from, politically somewhat separate, with it. And the other thing about Antioch was also considered to be one of the holy cities, because in the various courses that I've done about early Christianity, we talk about the centers of Christianity being, Jerusalem, but then beyond that, Alexandria, Antioch, then Constantinople, and Rome. So, Rome, Constantinople were really the only ones left outside of Islamic influence, but Antioch. And so, from the perspective of the Crusaders, Antioch was a holy city to be retaken. And it was also that. So, and Antioch, it had only been about, at least according to this, a little over 10 years when it was last under Byzantine or Christian control. So the one thing about siege warfare that talking about when in battles and sieges, is that you often have these things about these great towers and like trying to bust down the walls and things like that. But what a siege really is, it's cutting off the supplies and starving people. Or cutting off the supplies so that they're not able to fight back, and you lower that resistance, and then you can take it. And the walls, basically, the difference with this is that the walls are ones that you try to you put pressure on them. Okay. And the idea is you put pressure on them by reducing or cutting off their supplies, and a siege works by whoever outlasts the longest. And so, there's always combat going on, but the idea is you're not trying to knock down walls ultimately, because if you do, then you got to rebuild it to defend the city again. But basically, you're trying to force a surrender. That's what happened at Nicaea. Like Nicaea, they never actually breached the walls. They managed to just cut them off and forced to surrender. So, among other things, starve them out. And so, but Antioch is very well defended, and I've got a map of what the city looks like, and I'll be coming up to that in a couple slides, and you can see this. And not only that, they knew like this wasn't going to be a surprise. The forces there knew that this army of crusaders were coming. These barbarians from Europe were marauding across the countryside, and so they had time to prepare, to stock up, and to basically set their defenses. The city itself was, from its origins, very well defended. From a very long time ago. I mean, it was originally the Seleucid. It's called Antioch, named after a Seleucid king, which was in after Alexander the Great. So I mean, for 1,300 years, they've had a chance to actually be building fortifications here for a long time. And the idea is that it was extremely well defended. So, but inside the wall, we have the Seljuk governor who's been there now for approximately 10 years, by the name of Yagi Sayan. But the population themselves were Orthodox Christian. So the ruler was Muslim, but the population were Eastern Orthodox Christians. And so many of the leaders of the Christian leadership, because there were Christian forces coming, they expelled them from the city. They didn't, and they also stockpiled supplies. They went out and they sent envoys out applying for aid. But the trouble is that apparently Yagi Sayan didn't get along well with nearby governors, specifically the governor of Aleppo, who actually just outright refused him aid or supply. But there were reinforcements that came from Damascus, from Homs, from Baghdad, but they would still take time to get there. So outside the walls, as the Crusaders arrive and they set things up, the Byzantines themselves in 968 had successfully retaken Antioch, but the way that the Byzantines did it is that they set things up way at a distance and just cut off supplies, and they didn't make direct assaults on the walls. But of course, you can't tell that to the Europeans, because they felt that they knew siege warfare better, and they were admittedly good at it. The Crusaders themselves, because of that trip across Asia Minor, they had lost a lot of their fighting strength, and so they were waiting for reinforcements to arrive, and so you had different leaders advocating different things in terms of being able to do things. And Raymond the Fourth was, he said, let's just hit him directly. Whereas the other leaders were not so keen on laying assault. They looked at that and said, that's really too well defended. We're going to lose a lot of people if we do that, and we need to save a lot of our forces for Jerusalem. It's too well defended. So what they did is they set up their siege camps fairly close to the walls and gates to control access, so that people couldn't get in and out of it. So they're controlling access. The trouble is, when you set up that close, you're actually in position to be under fire. So the idea is that each of the different armies set up their own camps close to these lower walls of the city. And so, it's the same approach that they had taken back in Nicaea, quite a while, several months before, but they didn't have enough forces to completely surround the city. And so some supplies were actually able to be brought across the mountains that like Antioch itself was built up against against mountains. And so there could be supplies brought up and over into the city behind that. So it could still be supplied. And of course, with the camps being too close to the walls, they could be hit by missile fire. What are called raiding sorties. Basically, what they do is they briefly open the gates, send out a raiding force. They go hit, destroy supplies, and then breakneck speed back to the gate, and then just get in and go. So here's where the things were, is that they set up a blockade here. So Alexandretta is this way, and so this river, the Mediterranean Sea, is basically out towards this area. But the actual walls around Antioch itself extended beyond up and into like well up into the top parts of this. But you can see that there's these the walls all through this, and it's right up against the mountains here. And so they set up these forts here, these fortifications outside the gate, to basically as blockades on the different roads. And then each of the different crusaders also set up camps, and these ones were really quite close. So again, when dealing with a military campaign, it's not just about swords and shields. It's actually more important is communications and supplies. And so if you can limit the supplies of your opponent, and if you limit their communication, they can't coordinate to respond against you. So that's really what they were trying to do. The governor inside the fortress was able to communicate with external forces. They was able to bring extra supplies in. And the Crusaders themselves, curiously enough, had a network to be able to communicate with Christians inside the city. Interesting. And so everybody knew what everybody else was up to. And there was just this kind of holding pattern as to who could outlast the other. And curiously enough, it was actually the Crusaders themselves who started to run out of supplies. And even though they had set up this naval support in the mouth of the river, right on the Mediterranean, the shipping network was set up. The Seljuks were able to harass these and initially limit that success. So what eventually happened is two of the leaders, Bohemond and Robert of Flanders, they took several forces away from the actual siege itself to go on foraging expeditions. We need supplies, so they took forces with them. So this was on. I put dates here. I do not expect you to memorize the dates at all. They're not required. But that was about 20,000 troops, and that was almost half. So of course, the governor inside Antioch sees this and sees the troops leave and launches this counteroffensive of the troops. And curiously enough, but Raymond IV was able to saw it coming and was able to force the Seljuks back into the city and almost breach one of the gates while Bohemond and Robert of Flanders were out on their foraging expedition. And they ran into, but while they were out there, they also ran into this expedition, a relief force coming from Damascus, and they managed to repel them. But unfortunately, they lost their own supplies in the encounter. So and it just, all of this is going on, and it's just crazy. Now, remember also that split where he said, well, we are going to go this way, and then another group decided, no, we're going to go down through Tarsus. And so Baldwin and Tancred had taken their own forces, split away from the main force many months before. They didn't trust the Byzantine guides and tried to find their own way. And so Tancred himself started seizing control of several cities and fortresses, including Tarsus itself. Um, and they even were fighting. They were fighting over who would control what on the way through. Um, and eventually, Tancred would join back up with the main crusading force, whereas Baldwin, who was just sick and tired of this, just continued moving east. You know, not even interested, didn't even go to Antioch, just took his forces and kept going east to the city of Edessa, because Baldwin himself was looking for something else, and this is where that whole greed thing comes in. Many of these people had their own agendas, and Baldwin at this point decides to move on his, because at this point in time, he has no long like his wife died. He no longer had any claim to her lands in Europe as well. He was a leader without land, and so he had no motivation to do anything except go back to Europe. And so heading eastward to Edessa, um, the governor of Edessa had extended an invitation and sent envoys to the Crusaders, who largely ignored him. But Baldwin took up on the offer. But he said, "I'll do this if you make me your adopted son." And so Edessa is here. So, you know, Antioch is here, and Edessa is over here. And this is important. This is important. Um, because what eventually happens is that, you know, he comes to Edessa, and the this area is largely and dominantly Christian in this area, nowhere even remotely close to being on the way to Jerusalem at all. But you know, they were welcomed with open arms, and he was able to secure the area from the Seljuk Turks, who are now concentrating their forces on what was ever happening at Antioch. So they took advantage and were able to step into that power vacuum and to establish control. And so here we have Baldwin portrayed as the liberator, and you know, and what we have here is that somehow, suspicious, after Baldwin's success, um, the uh, Thoros was assassinated, and so because he became his adopted son, um, Baldwin therefore became the first Count of Edessa. And so in this time, a new nation state called the County of Edessa was firmly under the political and military control of someone from Europe. And this was the first this state, instead of returning it to the Byzantines, which he had supposedly given his word that he would return it to Byzantine control, he said, "No, this territory is mine." And therefore he basically set up his own kingdom. This would be the first of what were called Crusader states, and we're gonna see more of that by the end of tonight. That anyway, so you know, long and the short, you know, everybody's moving to Antioch. Baldwin says, "I'm going to go my own way." Manages to kind of take advantage of a power vacuum and establishes a separate nation state in based around Edessa. So at this point in time, you know, he assumes the noble title of count, and becomes a county. You know, and the trouble is the terms that we use here at county being a local regional district. In this case, it's the land under the control of someone who has the noble title of a count. But effectively, he's the king of Edessa. And then at that point in time, he then decided to say, "You know what? Now that I'm established, I'm now going to send some supplies and help out with Antioch. So now we get back to Antioch here, and we have again, we have Tancred's the fortress here. We have another fortress here guarding the road, and then another fortress here, and then several smaller camps located on around Antioch itself. Getting back to communications and supplies. So, with that meantime happening, it did have an impact on the siege itself. And so, but the siege just dragged on um, for months. And in the time, this is a geologically active area. And when things begin to shake, people begin to assign uh, divine motivation behind them. So you have earthquake, you have heavy rain, you have when the sky is clear, an aurora borealis, and like significantly, what's happening behind me here. To see an aurora borealis as far south as southern Turkey, that is very significant. And they were all interpreting it as signs of having lost God's favor. And so, the supplies are coming by sea, but the thing is, things aren't going well. Things are very much in a stalemate. One out of every seven soldiers dying of starvation. So they're not really in battle ready. So, the soldiers themselves begin to desert, including, by the way, Peter the Hermit, who led the People's Crusade, had kind of joined up. I think I mentioned that last week, but he had kind of joined up with the group and followed them. And at this point, Peter the Hermit had enough. Um, and so the and also the Byzantines themselves said, what, we're done. So things are not going well. So the Crusaders then start building their own fortifications to protect their supply lines coming in. And curiously enough, it still took a while. I mean, considering when they arrived and things did start to improve, and they actually managed to the Crusaders themselves were also sending out diplomatic envoys, including to a rival Muslim power led by the Fatimids, which we will get to as well. They largely controlled sections of Egypt, but also up into into Seljuk territory, and they were enemies of the Seljuks. I had mentioned that. I had mentioned that last time, that really, for the most part, the Seljuks themselves were more concerned with the Fatimids and sort of the enemy is my ally. And so they were looking for different ways to take the city. And so they knew that the Seljuks were getting reinforcements, but the idea is, in an act of subterfuge, basically, this time, instead of the Byzantines actually negotiating this, it was the Crusaders themselves. And it was an Armenian Christian inside the city contacted Bohemond and said, I will give you the city in exchange for money and if you give me a title. Because titles were very important in that day. And so, he brought the proposal, he could, as long as Firuz would become the prince of Antioch. Thing is, not everybody agreed with this. Raymond was very much his oath of loyalty, returned that to the Byzantines. And so one of the leaders just simply said, you know what, I'm done, and left. But they still decided to move ahead with the plot. And so on June 2nd, so this is a good long time. What they do is they fake a departure. Because the others had seen these other forces leaving, and so they decided, let's play into that, pretend that we're leaving, and then they returned under the cover of darkness. And a small group basically managed to scale the walls near the towers that Firuz was under command of, and then they opened what's called the postern gate. Basically, it's a supply gate and basically at that point, um, a bunch of forces that were in position entered the city. They overwhelmed the garrison, and they basically managed to gain control of all the city. But unfortunately, in the process, as is typical of these things, thousands of Christians and Muslim civilians were killed. Because, of course, at this point in time, Western European military forces who were, on the surface Christian, couldn't tell the difference between a Middle Eastern Christian and a Middle Eastern Muslim. And they didn't care. And of course, the instead of treating their captive governor with dignity, they it was it the whether it didn't seem that so much the Crusaders, but actually people in the town, that Armenian Syrian Christians had taken the governor and executed him. And so the so afterwards, Bishop Adhemar had reinstated the Orthodox patriarch of Antioch that the Seljuk governor had previously expelled. So, which is interesting because Adhemar himself was from the Latin Church, whereas the patriarch would be definitely Greek, would have been Greek speaking, would have been representative of a form of Orthodox Christianity that was central to Antioch. But of course, once they took Antioch itself, they began to realize that they need to reinforce itself because the Seljuk Turks are not going to take this lying down. And so because they knew that there was another army coming, and of course, 2 days after Antioch had fallen to the Crusaders, they're in control of the city, and this new force of the Seljuk Turks had arrived. And they began to assault the city on June 7th. They established a siege, and of course, the Crusaders themselves, because they had more or less spent themselves crashing up against the walls of Antioch, they were themselves badly depleted. Whereas Stephen of Blois, who actually had abandoned them, managed to convince the Byzantine emperor, had actually convinced them to turn back because he had abandoned them and said, no, it's not worth it. Just go back. We're not aware of the success. And the thing is, at this point, everything seemed lost. Now, before I get into this part, keep in mind, this is a group of people that themselves were highly superstitious. And so that superstition was a lot of the driving force with the People's Crusade. And even as well supplied and well disciplined as this military force was, there was enough amongst the rank and file themselves who really probably were a lot more like the People's Crusade in and of themselves of being highly superstitious. And they needed a miracle, and they found one conveniently. That someone had a vision. A priest claimed to have a vision, and he said that the Holy Lance was somewhere in the city. In other words, and when he said the Holy Lance, that means that an artifact perceived to be the spear that pierced Christ's side. And sometimes called the spear of destiny. Even movies today have done something, but the idea was, and of course, curiously enough, a spear tip was unearthed in the Church of St. Peter inside the city, conveniently. And of course, Bishop Adhemar and Bohemond were actually themselves very skeptical that it was the authentic, that it was actually the real thing, because of course, when they were in Constantinople, there was another artifact that claimed to be the Spear of Destiny. So they were quite skeptical of it, but they said, you know what? Let's just take this as a morale boost and just and let them believe that. And so, whereas Raymond IV took it as the real deal, several others did, and a sign of impending victory, and it did the trick. And so the idea is that they, instead of staying inside the city, they actually came out and met the Seljuks on the battlefield. And at that point in time, the Turks themselves were distrustful of their leader from Mosul. And the leader from Damascus basically took his forces and left. And of course, with the Crusaders actually emerging out of the city, the Turks panicked and the remaining army scattered. And so Kerboga retreated to Mosul. And now at this point in time, the Crusaders owned Antioch outright. And so at that point, Beaumont declared the Principality of Antioch, which then, along with the county of Edessa, became what is called the Second Crusader State, because the Byzantines at that point had abandoned them because of Stephen of Blois had said, don't go there, and of course, communication being what it is. That they felt that we no longer have that loyalty, so now they established this another nation state, which would become the second Crusader state. So great, we've taken Antioch. Now it's time to go on to Jerusalem. And it did. Antioch was an important strategic goal at this point in time. They could resupply. They could ultimately get to their ultimate destination. But we need to wait, and we need to wait until November to set out. Partly because, as they had learned traveling across during the summer, and of course this was a full year later. Traveling in the summer was just not a good idea in a very warm climate. So they decided to actually travel when it was cooler. It would also allow them to rest, resupply, to have reinforcements come in. But they did fight over who, even though it was declared the Principality of Antioch, it was like who was actually the boss, who was actually in control. And ultimately, it would be Beaumont who would retain rulership of Antioch. It was mostly because he had the probably the most the forces there, but unfortunately, the there was an outbreak. Should say typhoid fever, not typhus. But there was an outbreak of there was a major disease outbreak. And Bishop Adhemar, who had been a moderating force amongst all of this, died of the disease himself on August 1st. And because he had kept these competing forces largely in check, now that he wasn't there anymore, everybody like these different competing forces, because no one was clearly in charge, began to argue and fight and amongst themselves. And he was not very keen on actually having Beaumont, for example, assume the title of ruler of Antioch. But of course, when he died, that resistance evaporated. So again, it would not be until January 99. So the 2.5 years, well, actually, if you do the math here, 3.5 years after the Pope declared crusade, 2.5 years, 2 and a bit years after they started moving in this direction. They started out from Antioch on their way to Jerusalem, and of those in the forces, we have Godfrey, we have Raymond, we have Robert II of Flanders, Robert II of Normandy, Tancred, and at that point in time, the force was actually considerably lower than it was. 1,500 knights, 12,000 foot soldiers, down from the nearly 40,000 that they had when they crossed over from Constantinople. But that's a force that they had. And what they did is that on their way down towards Jerusalem is that they collected tribute, from Tripoli. In other words, tribute is basically a bribe. They go up to the city and say, if you pay us a certain amount of money, we won't lay siege to you. And Tripoli acquiesced, and they basically bought them off. Um, and then the ruler of Tripoli agreed. You know what? If you take Jerusalem, we'll give you uh, we'll give you these cities effectively. Show us that you can do this, and we'll be there, but we won't get in your way. So from January until June, that's how long it took them to get to Jerusalem. It's about 700 kilometers. I mean, like you would think that like it's a much greater distance than you think it is. From Antioch to Jerusalem. They met very little resistance on the way. The siege at Arca, which was unsuccessful, the lasted from February to May. So they weren't marching the whole time. They had stopped to lay siege to Arca. But also in 1098, the Seljuk Turks no longer had control of Jerusalem. The Fatimids had been taking advantage of the Crusaders moving through and moved in on Seljuk holdings in the area. And so the Fatimids were the ones that were actually in control of Jerusalem. And they were trying to make peace with the Crusaders as they were coming forward, not really recognizing what the Crusaders were after at this point. Because at this point in time, you have this well-trained military force, but now they're really starting to gain the kind of insane fervor that the People's Crusade had as they're moving through. And what the Fatimids were doing, they just thought the Crusades, the Crusaders were the Byzantine forces just in different outfits, and so they didn't understand the nature of the group that was coming at them. They were trying to get back with the different agreements that they had already had with the Byzantines. Because the Byzantines themselves, at this point in time, like the Byzantines had gotten everything that they wanted, and they weren't really as aware of what was necessarily going on. But they certainly weren't really wanting to, but they weren't involved at this point in time. And so the last of these crusading forces get to Jerusalem on June 7th, and under this control, under the Fatimids, because the Crusaders were coming, anyone who was Christian, they in preparation for the siege, knowing what happened at Antioch, they expelled Christians from the city. But of course, the countryside around Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem is a city built on it's called Mount Zion. It is built on steep rock, steep-ish rocky terrain, dry, arid climate, not really a lot in the way of food or water, and so of course, but like at this point in time, as I mentioned, this well-trained military force has just kind of gone over into religious fervor at this point in time. And many of the low-level knights, they actually saw this as a reenactment or a retelling or their version of the Battle of Jericho from Joshua. And in fact, they actually attempted to replicate what happened at Jericho, because they started marching around the city, blowing horns and singing barefoot. No military sense at all, thinking that they do that and the walls will come falling down. And so June, and this is like June 7th, they arrive, they start doing this parade around Jerusalem, and then on the 13th they start assaulting the walls, fails horribly. And at that point in time, then the religious fervor sort of dies away, at least somewhat, and realize, oh, okay, we need to get down to business because we're going to have to take these walls down ourselves, because the horns and Jericho isn't working. So anyway, they go out into the countryside. They forage for wood, make for building ladders and siege towers, and um, so the Genoese themselves, who are Genoa in what is now modern day Italy, were now starting to bring supplies down to the port of Jaffa. Um, and so, in addition to the woods, the wood being gathered from the countryside, from Samaria, they actually started dismantling the ships that were bringing supplies over and built them into these enormous siege towers. And so on July 14th, they bring these enormous siege towers up to the walls. And we have one on the northwest and one on the south. Now, what a siege tower is basically it's a large wooden structure on wheels that has a series of ladders inside it and a large platform that basically it's built tall enough, and then is wheeled up to the wall. A platform comes down, and then the soldiers themselves can then move across this platform onto the top of the walls and basically invade that way. So, but siege warfare is a nasty business. So, they're trying to. These are made of wood. Wood is flammable. Hit them with flaming arrows. Hit them with oil. Try and light the thing on fire. But the Northwest Siege Tower, on the other hand, managed to spot like, the people on it, or who were supervising it, managed to find a weak spot in the walls. And because Jerusalem, or the forces in Jerusalem were Fatimid, and because they had been spending so much time fighting the Seljuks themselves, that they were not in any degree of a significant fighting condition. So in fact, the Crusaders, in fact, did actually luck out when they came to Jerusalem, that the defenses were actually weaker than they understood them to be. And so because they were weak, at that point in time, the siege tower on the northwest managed to breach the walls, and the Crusaders then were into the city. And they got there. And unfortunately, we don't have what the numbers actually were, but that night that the Crusaders got into the city was a massacre. It was, Muslims and Jews who had fought against the Crusaders, they were killed. But it's also clear the Christians that were in the city who had not, you know, the Crusaders themselves, or the Christians who had been expelled because, again, they couldn't tell the difference. Many of them were killed. Any Christians that were probably in the city, again, they wouldn't have been able to tell the difference. But now, at this point in time, Jerusalem was now under European control. The Fatimids had sent another force to repel the Crusaders, but Godfrey of Bouillon had faced them down, and on August 12th, met them on the field of battle at Ascalon, which is south of. Let me just pull this. I'm going to pull this back on the map that I showed you earlier. So here's Jerusalem, and then Ascalon down here. So they knew the force was coming. So Godfrey took his forces out and met them on the field of battle at Ascalon. And at that point in time, again, just because of different circumstances, popped one slide too many. So again, on August 12th, we had the Battle of Ascalon. It was about a month after Jerusalem had fallen. And at this point in time, the Fatimans were certainly superior to the Crusader forces but these were battle-hardened troops. Godfrey's forces were very much battle-hardened. They knew warfare. They knew, and they had learned a lot of the lessons and became very good at it. We don't have a lot of records. We just know that the Crusaders did defeat the Fatimids, and they retreated to Egypt. And at that point in time, under the stewardship of Godfrey of Bouillon, the kingdom of Jerusalem was then established. And because Jerusalem was taken, the Tripoli honored the agreement, and they became the county of Tripoli. So, and the Battle of Ascalon was the last military action of the first Crusade. So we have from when the Crusade was basically announced in November of 1095 to August of 1099, this concluded the First Crusade. But what ended up here now is you ended up with the Crusader states, specifically the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, who had basically agreed to turn over control to the Crusaders, and the kingdom of Jerusalem. And you can see that some of the remaining elements of this, that you had these different Crusader states, the county of Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem, all separate political entities controlled by Europeans who, at the point where they were coming through, sort of started staking out their own claims of territory, of which, in terms of actual legitimate claims, had none, but they established themselves. So now, basically, the Eastern Mediterranean shoreline was now fully in control of Western European forces and influence. And it would remain that way for at least 40 to 50 years. And so that brings us to the end of this, in terms of, and here's the thing. This was the only crusade that was objectively successful. Still horrible in consequences, but every other crusade that happened because of what happened here. And so that we're and almost perfect timing. We're just here right at 8:30 now. The if you have any questions, by all means. Again, I've been kind of going at this pretty quickly. But are there any other questions as we get to this point, or is this one of these situations where you feel that your brain is full? I'm seeing, Joy nod.
I could say one thing. I think it's very interesting. I'm really glad you're doing this.
Mm,
I have a book by Harold Lamb,
mm,
and it is about the Crusades, and so I've got a lot of even more detail in
mm.
there.
Yeah.
But it's very nice to see what you're doing, because well, I haven't read the book thoroughly yet,
Yeah.
so
Well,
it'll help me to
yeah.
understand as well.
And I think the trouble with doing a session like this is kind of a broad overview. Like I did this in two sessions, and I mean, you can actually do a full level university course doing three classes a week on the whole thing, just on the first crusade alone. Never mind the whole thing. Curiously enough, I actually I happened to be in the library at the church, and I noticed there was a book sort of tucked at the top, in our library that says, the Crusades on it. So I pulled it down and starting flipping through it, and I mean, it. The trouble is, um, it's useful in terms of it, sort of the different states, but it doesn't give you the kind of flow of how it unfolded, and how like how was it that a group of warlike Europeans managed against uh, their own stupidity, um, managed to successfully get to Jerusalem. And now I need to temper that. The reality is that many of the military commanders who were actually in control of this really did actually know what they were doing, and they were decent politics. They were, and the Byzantines were better at it, to be honest. But how different would have been if Stephen of Blois, who had basically abandoned the enterprise and taken his own forces back, and actually told the Byzantines that, what, like it's lost. Um, and despite that, the Crusaders managed to actually get to where they did. Um, and having the establishment of the county of Edessa, all of a sudden you had a potential supply line from of a friendly nation state, for lack of a better term, assisting here. And then you have you have the Great Seljuk Empire, you have the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which are basically broadly part of the same things, but this is more like a vassal state of this. They weren't able to stop the Crusaders because oddly enough, because of the ineptness of the People's Crusade, gave them a sense of complacency. And then once the real force came through, they weren't able to stop them.
Mhm.
And then of course, as you can see, like where they like the various areas of control that they have just basically follow a line, because they had no interest in going to Haran or Damascus or even Aleppo for that matter, and they somehow managed to do this. Now, one of the things that I'll talk about next week is that what was the Muslim reaction to the Crusades? And just to give you a little bit of a preview, is that the other thing that majorly contributed to the success of the Crusaders is the fact that the Muslim states in this area were all divided. They were fighting each other. The Fatimids and the Seljuks were actually enemies. They didn't perceive the Crusaders as being enemies at all. An annoyance at best. Um, and yet, because they had been so busy fighting each other, they had weakened each other enough that when the Crusaders did manage to come through, they weren't able to stop them. Um, and so the um, but this did actually establish basically, these so-called Crusader states. And this is about, here we have the date on this is about 1135. So this is about approximately what it would look like about 40 years after the Battle of Escalon in 1099. Well, okay, maybe not 40 years, but 36 years afterwards. That's what it ended up looking like. So not only that, these Islamic powers themselves also were weakened enough that they weren't actually able to move against the Crusader states in any meaningful way for generations. Um, and we'll get to that intervening period. Now, I Ridley Scott made a movie called The Kingdom of Heaven.
I saw that.
Yeah. So The Kingdom of Heaven is actually set really it's not actually set during one of the Crusades. It's actually set during, if I remember correctly, and I do need to look this up, and I'll make sure that I look it up for next week. It's actually set just before the launch of the Second Crusade because it deals with the Jerusalem falling to Salah ad-Din, which we'll deal with with next time. Um, and um, uh, and what the circumstances looked like approximately 50 to 100 years later, a couple generations later, where the kingdom of Jerusalem is established, as are many of the other Crusader states are still established. Um, but you have the Islamic forces beginning to reunite, but it takes a very long time for them to eventually do so. And so I will get into that, but the kingdom of heaven also shows the various communication networks that the European powers had then started to developing in terms of those trade routes uh, back and forth into Europe, where now that you had this area now under Western control, Western European control, you had these shipping routes open that more or less bypassed the Byzantines, going straight into Jerusalem, and actually would give Europe a lot of access to more direct access to these areas, and frankly put them in contact with Muslims directly, which curiously enough would eventually lead to the Renaissance. Um, uh, but that's more a session 6 thing that we'll deal with. So any other questions, comments, snide remarks?
What century did Lawrence of Arabia live in?
20th.
20. Oh, he's pretty new.
Oh yeah.
Oh, okay.
Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence was a British military officer assigned to the Arab Bureau in Cairo in during the Second World War, and was instrumental in aiding the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Turks during the First World War.
Okay.
Um, and oddly enough, that's actually a little bit of history that I did study. But no, Lawrence of Arabia, and he famously wrote a book called The Seven Pillars of Wisdom, uh, the where he taught basically, and that is the book upon which the movie um,
Peter
uh,
O'Toole.
that Peter O'Toole is in. And yeah, and the thing is, I mean, but yeah, he did 20th century First World War. I believe he died in a motorcycle accident in 1935, I believe. And sort of he had started to gain fame fairly early on. He was involved in and then shut out of the post First World War negotiations, where of course the British and French are promising all the different Arab powers the different things, ultimately setting themselves up against each other, which unfortunately has led to the current situation in the Middle East. Can largely be traced back to the aftermath of the First World War. But that's an entirely separate
Yeah.
thing. Um, because I mean, after the Crusader period, after the Crusader period, so after the 13th century, without getting into too many spoilers, that this area would remain under would not come back under European control. Well, depends on how you define European control. If you include the Ottoman Empire as being a European power, because it did extend into Europe, um, then it would return to under European control under the Ottoman Turks, but it wouldn't, in terms of Western European control, wouldn't happen until after the end of the First World War. So there would be this gap from 1291, approximately 1291, up through 1918. And Lawrence of Arabia was actually instrumental in that, even though he very much advocated for these Arab for self-determination amongst these Arab states.
Why was he not what kept him out of being a part of the negotiations?
They I arrogance, I suppose. Um, uh, because I mean, he clearly worked with them, but I think there were those in British leadership who thought that he had gone too native.
Hmm.
Um,
Sounds that sounds quite likely.
yeah, and that would certainly be part of it. I mean, he came to really appreciate the Arabic culture. I mean, he was instrumental in coordinating things with the Arab Revolt, coordinated supplies, and supplies and money, to basically to bring the Bedouin tribes on, um, uh, into on side. I mean, curiously enough, one of the things that I noticed about, under the Kingdom of Jerusalem here, we have the entirety of the Dead Sea, Galilee, Jerusalem. But curiously enough, the Kingdom of Jerusalem seemed to be able to extend control down to what's here. And the town at the time in the Second World War that Lawrence of Arabia, oddly enough, actually was instrumental in was there's a town called Aqaba, um, which is right here on the coast, which if you are, and this is pre-Suez Canal, of course, by many, like by centuries, that if you wanted access to spices in India and things like that, setting up a port here that would give you access to the Indian Ocean, it's right here. And that's just an observational significance that they actually had access to the Red Sea. So interesting
Okay.
as that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, glad to offer it. And of course, next week we're dealing with the Second and Third Crusades. And the reason why I put those two together is because in time they were actually, they happened within a handful of decades of each other, and it's more or less, it was basically the Second and Third Crusade are basically one crusade, sort of, but separated by a couple of decades. There was a bit of a pause in there. But it was still, like during the time leading up to this, the Crusader culture is building. And that very much is in place. But we get to talk about that next week. So
Thank you.
not a problem. I'm gonna just quickly stop the recording. And this is for everybody who's watching this afterwards. We'll see you in the next one. And then if anybody wants to chat after I stop recording, we can do that. So we'll see you with the next one.